Welcome everyone. I'm super excited today to talk about two passions that I have, which are product management and poker. So a little bit about myself. My name is Derek Kwan. I am the Chief Operating Officer of Retention Science. I was formerly a product manager at Yahoo, and I've been doing product management for now almost 15 years. And I also recently wrote a book about building startups and sort of the mindset of a product manager. So what I'm going to be covering today is first we're going to go over the difference between a game of skill versus a game of chance, and then go over some poker basics. Then we're going to go into some concepts such as how to make decisions with imperfect information, how to not be results oriented in your decision making, and how to handle pressure in your product role. So these are just three topics where we can find some intersection between product skills and poker skills. But I write a lot more about this in my book, Bet Build Go, which is now available on Amazon. And I cover a broad range of topics outside of those three, which we're going to cover today. So first, game of chance versus a game of skill. So some of you may have seen the movie 21, which is based on the book Bringing Down the House. And the gist of this movie and this book is that a bunch of students from MIT joined a professional blackjack player named JP Masser, and they also paired with a Harvard professor to basically cheat these casinos out of like hundreds of thousands of dollars playing blackjack. And what they did was they deployed something called card counting. And what card counting does is as cards are removed from the deck, so when you see 3 kings are shown, you know there's only 1 king left. So being able to count all the cards and keep track of what's been shown and what's still left to be dealt allows you to really guess the probability of what the next cards will be. So being able to do that actually increases your advantage of winning. So they're able to then, bet deferring amounts based on how confident they were in the next cards to come. This is really successful. They ended up getting something like a 35x return on investment in their money playing blackjack. And this is actually quite incredible. And it's actually not something that you can typically do unless you're screwing the rules. And I'll explain a little bit why. So if you play blackjack in casinos, you may have seen these little hands out or pamphlets that they give you, which is really a playbook on how to play specific hands in blackjack. So, based on what you have, what the dealer is showing, this matrix basically shows you when you're supposed to stand, when you're supposed to hit, and when you're supposed to split. What this card will actually do is it will maximize your win rate. And that you might then ask, for a casino who makes money by beating me at blackjack, why are they teaching me the optimal way to play? And this is because, and not everybody knows this, but all games at casinos, whether it's blackjack, roulette, craps, slots, all these games are designed so that you cannot get greater than a 50% win rate. So 50% win rate is break even. So flipping a coin is a 50% win rate. You might flip heads 10 times in a row, but if you flip a coin hundreds or thousands of times, you'll get much, much closer to that 50% expectation. So in blackjack and in all these other games, you can't actually get higher than a 50% expectation. You can't even break even. So what casinos actually want you to do is they want you to really just win it around that 47, 48% win rate. They're basically winning money constantly from everybody 24/7, 365 days a year. And this is how they generate, millions to billions of dollars in revenue. So teaching you how to maximize your win rate can't actually even get you over 50%. So another clear example of this is on a roulette table. If you were to bet on, say, black or red, you might think that's a 50% like coin flip. But there are 2 numbers on the table. There are 0 and 00, which are green. They're neither black or red. So you can't even get a coin flip at a roulette table. So it's something to note that these casino games are designed so that you actually can't win in the long term, but you can win enough in the short term that you want to keep coming back. And this isn't to say that you shouldn't play these games. These games are still a lot of fun to go with your friends. And, any weekend in Vegas, I'm sure you can, win a couple of $1,000s and come home really happy. But if you were to play these games over and over again for, years and years and thousands of times, you will actually see yourself getting much, much closer to that 47, 48% win rate, which is below 50%, where you actually start to lose money. So this is why that card counting by these blackjack teams was so incredible to even get a 35x return in the long term. But this really indicates a difference between, a game of skill and a game of chance. These players weren't actually able to change the outcome of the game because you can't. You can't change the outcome of a game in blackjack. You cannot change the spin of a wheel in roulette. If you have cards that are closer to 21 than a dealer in blackjack, you win, and vice versa, the dealer wins. If you hit 2 on a roulette table, 2 wins and everything else loses. There's nothing that you can do to change the outcome of the game. What these blackjack players were doing were they were really just trying to guess at probability so they could change their bet sizing, but really they could do nothing to change the outcome of a deal of a hand or a spin of a wheel. So this is the difference between these games and poker. So poker, a game of skill and game of chance isn't just some term that gamblers made up. A game of skill and game of chance is actually a legal ruling that allows certain games to be played in specific states. So as an example, games that have been ruled a game of skill are things like fantasy football, darts, pool. You can wager money on these things, but they're clearly something where skill will win. But poker has been actually categorized as a game of skill in many, many states, but not all the states, because this is really kind of up to the individual state representatives. But this is a big difference between poker and everything else. A game of skill means that you can change the outcome of the game. If you have a better hand than I do, I can actually, for example, bluff and make you fold a better hand. And this is where the game of skill actually comes into play. Another note is that, casinos, you're not actually playing the casinos when you're playing poker, you're actually playing other players. So the casino doesn't make money from you winning or losing. What they do is they're just taking percentages, or what we call rake, out of pots, or a percentage of your tournament buy-in. So they're really just charging you fees for going in and playing poker at these casinos. So you can also see from there that that these casinos aren't actually making money off of the outcomes of these games. So how poker is basically played is you have 5 cards dealt, which are community cards, and these cards are shared by everyone. You have 2 whole cards, which is represented by the 2 aces on the top of the screen that nobody else can see. And what you're trying to do is make the best 5-card hand. So in this example, the best 5-card hand with the 2 whole cards of ace, ace, are ace, 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 king, king, which is 3 of a kind, 2 of a kind, which is called a full house. And that's typically a very, very strong hand. Each round of cards then comes with a round of betting, and this is generally how the game is played. So poker, back in the day, back in the old saloon days where people were just shooting each other in the streets, which thankfully we don't do anymore. Those were days where it was a lot more gambling, and you really couldn't tell what was going on, and you're trying to read other players. But over time, poker became much more sophisticated than that. And you can see on the screen, there's all this analysis done on poker now, which is quite mathematical, statistical, based on game theory. And a lot of these things are really useful for product managers to understand and note like what the methodology is to help themselves become better at their product roles. So first, we're going to jump into making decisions with imperfect information. So you can see the image on the right, which is a little bit funny. A lot of these players are trying to hide, their emotions and what they're doing. And while poker is still much more a game based on pattern recognition and math, there is a little bit of psychology in watching people. But the biggest thing that's imperfect information is you can't actually see these players' 2 whole cards, right? Their whole cards are hidden from you, so you really have no idea what they're doing. But then, this person who could be, he actually is a very skilled player. His name is Chris Vogelsang, and he's a high stakes poker tournament player. You can't exactly know what he's doing with his cards because you can't actually see his cards. So poker players have to make decisions with imperfect information all the time. So you also see on TV sometimes these poker players can actually guess really close to what that other player has, and you might think that it's magic, but it's not actually really magic. What they're really doing is applying observation. They're very actually good at observation, spotting non-verbal cues, but then a lot of it is really just pattern recognition. They can see from the way that you bet, how much you bet, what position you're in, and what you've kind of done in the past to really narrow down what they think your holdings are. They can do structured hand analysis based on, again, like your betting patterns and where you're kind of sitting, what you've done in the past. And each of these things helps to narrow things down. And this is very similar to how these blackjack players were counting cards. They're not really they can't exactly know what card will come next, but what they can do is reduce or basically improve the probability that they can guess what those hands are within a specific range. And that's what these poker players are doing. But you can also see how they're making really hard decisions in the moment, sometimes for a lot of money on really imperfect information. And you have to do this well to show, success in poker over the long term. There's also math, and obviously, as you're processing this information, just because you see those patterns or you see this person bet this amount, you have to know what to do with that information. And this is where critical thinking and probabilistic thinking, which is a really important concept, is applied to make sure that they can actually do something with this information. So going into product management, how can we make better decisions from this? So number one, 80% of the info is more important than 100% of the info if you're waiting a month later for it. You don't want a bunch of people sitting around waiting for you to get every single piece of information. Usually it's not necessary, and it's not going to actually bring you a better outcome than if you had just made a call. It's really important for product managers to be decisive. You have to be decisive. You can't wait for all the information. You can't have people sitting around. So 80% of the info is usually going to be better than waiting for 100% of the info, which you most of the time can't get anyway. So definitely with the information that you do have, make sure that you are at least analyzing it. So this is where you should take a little bit of time to do things like a cost benefit analysis, understanding upside and downside, like risk reward. Definitely understand the secondary and tertiary effects of your decisions. That's really a big one. You can't go around as a product manager constantly trying to solve first order problems only. You have to understand that when you make a decision about something and you fix one thing, you can't break 2 or 3 other things, because this is the, a ticket, really fast ticket to getting people to lose faith in you, from your engineering counterparts, your executives, your business users. You have to really make sure that you're thinking through the consequences of your decisions. So this mindset also applies to how you build products. So the virtue of doing proof of concepts are there for a specific reason. Proof of concepts get you to market faster. So you're not actually trying to do something 100% of the way. I think perfect is the enemy of good, right? So what you're really trying to do with proof of concepts is put something out there that has some amount of product market fit. And what you're really doing is you're trying to observe user behaviors and iterate from there, versus actually trying to build an all-the-way solution. Sometimes even in 3 months, users change, their behaviors might change, or competitors might change. And usually you cannot predict how users are actually going to use the thing that you're building. So it's much, much better that you go for something that's a little bit more lightweight and faster to market. And then, the way that you get there is making sure that your decisions are also, decisive, right? 80% of the info. This might not apply all the time for proof of concepts, because, particularly in enterprise software, maybe you need to actually go a little bit further to making sure that you're appeasing enterprise customers with your use cases. But in general, it's a good mindset to have, that you are trying to balance like speed and efficiency with accuracy. And this is something that, again, these poker players do all the time. So talking a little bit about risk reward. So looking at this matrix, you have high risk, high reward, low risk, low reward. So things that are high risk and high reward tend to be innovations. You only really need to do at least one of these a year to be innovative. And when you need to differentiate yourselves, you need to build a moat. High reward, low risk things. These are things that you should actually be attacking persistently, right? So things that are low risk, low level of effort, but they can reward you really, really well. These are things you want to repeat and be attacking constantly. High risk, low reward are things that really kind of don't make any sense. There's really no reason, when there's very, very little upside, to generally just work on anything. But then if that thing has a lot of high risk, those are certainly things that you should avoid. And then lastly, on the bottom right, things that are low risk and low reward, there's really no point in paying attention to any of these things. So make sure that you are thinking through the cost benefit analysis and the risk reward and the upside downside of all the decisions that you're making. So next, we're going to cover how to not be results oriented. So in poker, and on the left, you can see Ace King. So Ace King is actually one of the best starting hands in poker that you can have. 7-2 is the worst starting hand in poker, and this is a hand that you should almost never ever play. But you can see that running simulations, if Ace King and 7-2, 7 deuce were to go all in pre-flop, 7 deuce still wins 33% of the time, which is pretty crazy. 33% of the time, 7 deuce is going to win. And the chart on the right shows, a graph of basically, if, let's just take as an example, you were to get in with Ace King versus 7 deuce, you should really see that line becoming a 67% win rate for Ace King over time. But in the short term, that 7 deuce at 33% could equate to losing 20 times in a row, right? Ace King versus 7 deuce, and that might be a perfectly normal thing. But over hundreds and thousands of times that you're playing Ace King against 7 deuce, you'll get much, much closer to that 67% win rate, which is why it's really important for you to think about long-term and not focus on short-term outcomes, because these kind of things are going to happen. So PMs need to be process-oriented and not outcome-oriented. So good processes that lead to good outcomes are typically going to be healthy, self-reinforcing behavior, right? So if you're following good processes, and like we talked about earlier, you're thinking through the way that you are making your decisions, the way that you're implementing products, building features, those lead to good outcomes. That's really healthy and self-reinforcing behavior. To that right quadrant, this is a really important one to pay attention to. You can have a perfectly good process that leads to a bad outcome. So for example, you keep getting ace king in against 7 deuce and you keep losing. It's a bad outcome, but it doesn't necessarily mean it was a bad decision. It actually means that it was a very, very good decision. So good processes that lead to bad outcomes can be quite discouraging, and it might actually make you blink and think that it was a bad process. So this is why it's really important for you to stay disciplined and understand which processes are good, which processes are bad. And if processes and decisions are objectively good, good outcomes will come eventually, and you have to look past any short-term bad outcomes. So next on the bottom, you have bad processes that lead to good outcomes. This is also another really important one to pay attention to. If you have bad processes that lead to a good outcome, like you keep getting in with 7 deuce and then you keep winning, you might think that this is great and I'm going to keep doing it all the time. But really what's going to happen is that it's really not a repeatable result. And it's very, very dangerous to think that a bad process that didn't think through secondary and tertiary effects, that wasn't really thought through, that was somehow going to lead to success in the long term, and that will never ever happen. So you really need to make sure that you're also disciplined and recognizing which ones are a bad process and stopping doing those immediately, even if they are leading to some good short-term outcomes. Bottom right, bad outcome, bad process. This is pretty self-explanatory. I don't know what I expected, but it does still give you an opportunity to make sure that you're measuring and thinking about what your processes are, right? So it's a lot of, it's a really good idea to do retros and in retrospect, look back at the things that you're doing some kind of analysis to make sure that you're following the framework that we talked about earlier, so that you can more focus on the top quadrants that are leading to good processes that will, regardless of whatever is happening in the short term, that eventually will lead to good outcomes for your product and for your company. So a better way, focus on decision-making and not outcomes, right? So you definitely don't want to pay attention to these short-term, shocks and things that are happening, whether they're good or bad. Focus on decision-making, making sure you're thinking through opportunity costs and trade-offs. So every decision actually is a trade-off. You're trading off something or the other for whatever you're doing today. So also think through, if I didn't do this one thing with the resources that I had, what could I have done instead? And could that thing have been better? Would that have led to better outcomes in the long term? And as we're going to repeat quite often, make sure that you are going long and you're thinking about the long term. This is the most important thing. All of these bad outcomes in the short term will eventually, lead to good outcomes, on a long enough timeline. Have big picture context. Make sure that you are following the mission. And if your company currently doesn't have a really strong mission, really push the founders, push the CEO to really think through that mission. Missions are your North Star. Missions are aspirational, right? They are things that you aspire to that you can't ever really achieve. As an example, Facebook's mission is to bring the world closer together. It's not something that you can ever really achieve, but it's something that you always aspire to. And then your product strategy, your product vision should always tie back to your mission. And then with that big picture context, you can always check into the things that I'm prioritizing today, the things that are in my 6-month, 12-month roadmap. Do they actually map up to the vision, and do they actually map up to the mission, right? If they don't, why am I doing them? But then thinking about long-term, constantly thinking about good decisions, you can see how over time things will become much more of a healthy ecosystem. Then definitely being disciplined. So as we talked a little bit earlier, on the top right quadrant, recognize you got unlucky and keep trying for good process and bad outcome. And then the bottom left quadrant, which is bad process, good outcome, make sure that you're being disciplined, that even if you have bad outcomes when you're objectively making good decisions, that you keep repeating those good decisions anyway, because the bad outcomes will stop. But on the bottom left, you also have to be disciplined with, just because you got lucky with a good outcome with a bad process, you really need to stop doing that. All right, so lastly, we're going to talk about handling pressure. So this is, another big thing, in poker and in product management. So understanding pressure is that, product managers, you are always a de facto leader in your organization. And leaders, your job is to turn chaos into structure. You are supposed to be calm and practice stoicism, right? In the face of all of these crazy things that are happening, you have to take, really deeply technical concepts and be able to make, business users and executives understand those things in simple ways. You have to take sometimes half-brained, half-baked, not thought through business requirements and turn them into structured user stories and requirements for your engineering teams to build off of, right? So understanding where your place is in the organization should help you actually be pressure, because there's a lot of people depending on you to be leaders, right? Also, focusing on decision making and not outcomes is really important, because if you understand that it's the process and not the outcome, then all of a sudden your fear of failure starts to lessen, because really a lot of fear comes from failing and doing the wrong thing. But if you know that the process is good, no matter what's happening in the short term, things will even out in the long term. And these are some of the things that you'll see the very, very best poker players practicing on a day-to-day basis. Certainly also focus on solutions and not emotions. Poker players can lose ace king 100 times in a row and lose a lot of money, but they, the best ones will not get emotional about it, and they will just keep doing that good repeatable process, knowing that the numbers are going to even out. So this doesn't mean that you're not empathetic to others, right? So you need to be empathetic to others. Sometimes people need to kind of vent, so you want to hear them out, and they're not exactly looking for a solution in the moment. But right after that part where you are being empathetic and listening to people, you should yourself and also be guiding your organization to focus on solutions, because everything really is a problem and a solution, and you have to look at things objectively to stay calm. Going long is another thing we're going to keep repeating. As long as you're thinking about the long term, you'll know that these short-term shocks are going to even themselves out, right? So people may be pretty familiar with Paul Graham's startup curve, which is also called like the trough of sorrow. You can just see that all startup journeys are not linear, and no matter whether you're working at a big company or a small company, you're going to have ups and downs and failures and successes. But really, if you look at that over a very, very long timeline, those things tend to even out. And as long as you're making good decisions, then that line will be going up. So going long should also help you a little bit with feeling with the pressure in the moment. But just think of all of these things collaboratively and all together as how you can handle pressure better in your product role. Lastly, practicing mindfulness is a big thing, and maybe I'm not a complete expert at this, but I have used Headspace for a little bit, and that's definitely helped me calm myself in certain moments and certain times. So definitely doing things like meditation, yoga, a lot of different things, and even just getting some exercise. Mindfulness also helps kind of your body physically be able to adjust to anxiety and pressure. So combine that with really just the objective ways that you have to look at how you are supposed to be a leader in the organization, and these are really, really good ways in which you can beat pressure. So to focus on going long, so on the screen is Bryn Kenny. He is right now currently the top earning tournament player in the world, and you can see on the right, he has total live earnings of $56 million, which is absolutely absurd. So what's actually happening here is on the left is that Bryn Kenny played a high roller tournament where he won $20 million in one shot, and that was the biggest tournament winning by one person in a single tournament ever. So really what's going on here is that you're looking at one of the best tournament players in the world. And I've actually played with him several times, and he really is as good as they say. But he wasn't like an overnight success. We actually look a little bit closer at his results. You can look at, this guy was actually playing poker since 2007, or at least tournament poker. And you can just see how his results, $6 million is still an enormous amount of money, but he was grinding away, for 5-6 years at this range. And before he started having a little bit more confidence in himself, and you can draw some corollaries to the way that we think about product management and decision-making, he saw that the decision that he was making was good. And then over time, those outcomes seemed to start becoming more repeatable over years and years and hundreds and thousands of tournaments. So then he started being more confident in his decision-making, and he started playing higher stakes. And he started, so that tournament in which he won $20 million was a $1 million buy-in. So he had to pay $1 million to actually enter the tournament. But you can see how then over a 10, 11 year, 12 year timeline, this is where he, skyrocketed into the upper echelons of poker tournament success. But really, what you should get away from this is that, a lot of the successes that you see tend to be people who really were doing it for a very long time. So always think about the long term in the things that you're doing, and this will help across a lot of different things, from your decision making to handling pressure and a broad range of benefits for product managers. So, we covered 3 big topics today, but then if people are interested in learning more about this, I talk a lot about this in my book, Bet Build Go. I talk about exploitative, there's poker strategy, and I go a little bit more thoroughly into poker strategy, but I also give really great, real life business use cases for startups like Netflix, like Uber, like Airbnb. I also even cover, the NBA draft and the 76ers and how they coined the term trust the process for long-term thinking. There's a lot of different things, and even a checklist from setting your mission, talking about the software development lifecycle. So there's all these great things that product managers can learn from poker players. And sometimes, you might see poker players as these degenerate gamblers, which, sometimes they are, but the very, very best poker players practice all of these things. And it really is a mindset, and it's a tense amount of preparation and discipline to get things to work. So BetBillGo is on Amazon, so feel free to go and take a look at that. You can also connect with me on LinkedIn. Definitely, if you want to connect with me, ask me some questions, talk a little bit about product management. Just let me know, in your introduction that you saw this poker talk and you would like to connect with me to talk about poker, and I'd be happy to connect with you and chat with you. You can also follow me on Twitter. I'm Quansful on Twitter, and also I have a blog, which I actually, quite honestly, don't really update that often. But as I get some time this year, hopefully I'll start putting up a couple more different blog posts. So that's it for today. Thank you so much for joining. I'm going to kick it back over to Napur, who's going to wrap it up with you guys.
Thank you, Derek. That was awesome. Before we leave today, just remember that we offer weekly online and on-site events in more than 100 cities. Also, you can find us on social media at Product School, and be sure to keep up with the latest product management content at productschool.com/blog. Thank you all for joining. Enjoy the rest of the day and hope to see you next week. Thank you, Derek. Once again.
Thank you, Napur.